London, 1388. Before sunrise, a crowd forms around the execution ground. People stand tightly packed, not because they must, but because they want to see what is about to happen. Medieval London treated public punishment as a civic event. Attendance was common, curiosity was normal, and today's execution will be remembered as one of the most extreme carried out under English law. The condemned man is Thomas Usk, not a rebel soldier, not a violent criminal. He was a city official, a clerk, a negotiator, and at one time a trusted figure inside London's administrative system. His work involved drafting legal texts, mediating disputes, and assisting the governance of the city. Yet this morning, none of that matters. To the authorities, he is a traitor. To the crowd, he is a spectacle. Usk is about to face the full sequence of the punishment known as hanging, drawing, and quartering, a method formerly reserved for men convicted of high treason. In practice, it functioned as a political weapon, a public demonstration of state power designed to intimidate the population. The stages are clear. He will be hanged until near death. In treason cases, hanging is intentionally interrupted to keep the prisoner alive. He will be cut open while still conscious. This includes the removal and public display of internal organs, a procedure meant to strip the condemned of dignity and identity. He will be torn apart by horses, 4 limbs tied to 4 animals, each forced to pull until the body separates. This is not designed to deliver a clean death. It is designed to eliminate the person physically, symbolically, and politically. Thomas Usk's case is exceptional not because of the method, which was legally defined, but because of who he was. A bureaucrat rarely faced such punishment unless his political associations placed him in the path of a factional conflict. And in 1388, English politics was unstable. Rival groups around King Richard II fought for influence, and those who aligned with the wrong faction often became targets when power shifted. Usk's downfall began inside London's council chambers. There, alliances shifted quickly. Supporters of the king fell out of favor. Accusations of disloyalty became tools, not truths. Usk was caught in this environment. His former connections were now liabilities. The label of traitor was applied not because of violent conspiracy, but because his political network collapsed. In the medieval legal system, treason could be defined broadly, and with the right pressure, almost anyone could be made guilty. This moment, the crowd waiting, the scaffold ready, is the final stage of that political process. What is about to happen to Thomas Usk is not primarily punishment for a crime. It is the state asserting dominance during a period of internal instability. To understand how a civil servant became the subject of England's most brutal sentence, we must trace the political tensions that surrounded him. His execution begins with fear, not his, but the government's. Thomas Usk was not a rebel. He did not command soldiers. He held no military power. His influence came from paperwork, negotiation, and language. In medieval England, this could be far more dangerous than carrying a weapon, because documents could shift alliances, words could shape authority, and political writing could place a man directly in the path of factional conflict. The 1380s were among the most unstable years of King Richard II's early reign. The king was young, and real power operated behind him, inside councils and private networks, and among rival groups of nobles. England faced economic pressure, lingering unrest from the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, and deep divisions in how the realm should be governed. 2 main factions emerged. One supported strengthening royal authority, the other argued for limiting the king and empowering leading nobles. This conflict did not stay theoretical. It turned into a struggle for dominance, and it played out through accusations, purges, and sudden political reversals. Thomas Usk, working within London's civic administration, became involved with one of these networks. He aligned himself with individuals tied to the king's circle, people who, at the time, appeared secure. They controlled influence, appointments, and access to power. For Usk, supporting them was logical. His career depended on alliances. No official operated independently. Every advancement required backing. But political protection was unstable. In 1387 and 1388, the faction known as the Lords Appellant launched a coordinated attack against the king's supporters. They accused several of Richard II's allies of treason, removed them from office, and, in some cases, executed them. Control of government shifted nearly overnight. Records from the period describe it as a constitutional crisis, a moment when political survival depended on choosing correctly which group would dominate. Usk chose incorrectly. Within days, individuals he once worked with were arrested. Others fled London. Some publicly renounced any association with the king's circle. The network Usk relied on dissolved rapidly. Meanwhile, London's civic authorities sought to demonstrate loyalty to the new ruling force. Punishing those tied to the king's faction became a way to prove alignment with the ascendant group. Usk was exposed. His past allegiances were now liabilities. His connections were reinterpreted as evidence against him. Where once he was described as helpful and diligent, he was now labeled suspicious. Colleagues stopped speaking to him. Officials he had collaborated with no longer defended him. Political survival in late medieval England depended on visibility, and suddenly no one wanted to be seen at his side. The charge against him came quickly. A royal declaration was issued. Thomas Usk, guilty of treason, sentence, to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. This was the most severe penalty under English law. Technically reserved for men who attempted to overthrow the government or assist foreign enemies, Usk's actual actions did not match these criteria. But the legal definition of treason was flexible. Especially during periods of political upheaval, his execution served a function. There was no formal investigation, no legal defense, nothing resembling a modern trial. The purpose was not to determine guilt, but to remove a man associated with the losing faction. To the public, the message was simple. Another enemy of the realm had been identified and defeated. To the political elite, the message was strategic. Punish someone visible enough to reinforce the power shift. Usk became a target, not because of a crime, but because he could be used to demonstrate the authority of those now in control. His death would be public, his suffering would be public, and the state intended that the memory of his punishment would deter others from supporting the wrong side. Thomas Usk's fate illustrates a crucial characteristic of medieval politics. Loyalty was temporary, and the definition of treason depended on which group held power at the moment. His execution was not caused by a single act. It was the result of a political environment in which alliances collapsed faster than individuals could adapt. He was swept up in the aftermath, a bureaucrat caught between competing visions of authority. This is why, within months of choosing a side, he went from respected official to condemned traitor. What followed was not just death. It was the full display of medieval state power delivered through the most extreme punishment England used. Night inside the Tower of London in the late 14th century was not silent. The tower served as fortress, armory, and prison. Prisoners awaiting execution rarely slept. Guards moved through the corridors. Chains clinked. Torches crackled. And in the distance, work continued in the outer yard. For Thomas Usk, this night was the final stage of a rapid political collapse. He had been sentenced to death by hanging, drawing, and quartering, the full penalty for high treason. The process was scheduled for the next morning. No appeal was possible. Once the order was written, the outcome was fixed. His cell was small and damp. Like most holding spaces in the tower, prisoners of high status were sometimes granted better rooms. But Usk's political situation made that unlikely. He was not being preserved as a valuable hostage. He was being removed as a political liability. He was given one object, a piece of parchment. This allowance was not an act of mercy, it was procedural. Some condemned prisoners were permitted to write final statements, partly for record-keeping and partly because written confessions could be used later by authorities for political narratives. Usk used the parchment differently. He wrote not a confession, but an account, a reflection on how accusations of treason were shaped by shifting alliances. His surviving text suggests he understood exactly what had happened to him. Treason was not always a matter of action, but often a matter of association. The winning side defined guilt. The losing side supplied the guilty. His handwriting, normally steady in official documents, now trembled cold. Stress and shackles all contributed. Medieval cells had no climate control. Winter drafts entered freely. Prisoners slept on straw or bare boards. Conditions were consistent with physical discomfort and sleeplessness. As he wrote, Usk heard noises outside the tower yard. These sounds were documented in several execution cases. The construction or preparation of the scaffold workers hammered wooden beams together. A platform was required for the hanging stage, and space was needed for the subsequent procedures. The fact that he could hear the work reinforced the finality of his situation. Each hammer strike served as a practical reminder of what awaited him. There was no uncertainty, no delay, no alternative outcome. By morning, he would be brought from the tower, transported to the execution site, and subjected to a sequence designed to demonstrate state strength. Usk paused in his writing and examined his hands. These same hands had once sealed official documents. Medieval administration relied heavily on written contracts, charters, and petitions. Clerks like Usk played essential roles. Their handwriting could influence legal decisions, property disputes, and political communication. Now those same hands were symbolic evidence in the eyes of his accusers, proof of his connection to a faction that had fallen from power. Under the sentence of treason, his hands would not remain intact. It was common for the authorities to display body parts at city gates, bridges, and other public points. The intention was deterrence. Anyone entering or leaving the city would see the physical result of disloyalty. Usk knew this. He understood the system well enough to predict the use of his remains. The torch in his cell burned unsteadily. Tower lighting relied on oil lamps or torches. Neither provided consistent illumination. Flickering shadows across stone walls created an environment shaped more by instability than by darkness. Prisoners often reported that such conditions amplified fear, not through horror imagery, but through physical uncertainty, shifting light, irregular sound, inconsistent temperature. Usk closed his eyes. He did not rest. Prisoners facing execution rarely did. Instead, they reviewed their past decisions. In Usk's case, his writings indicate that he revisited his political choices, his service to the city, and the turning point where loyalty became fatal. There was no doubt or denial left. He recognized his situation as the product of political realignment, not legal justice. Outside, the hammering continued. Construction at night was unusual, but not unprecedented. Authorities wanted the scaffold ready before dawn, both for crowd control and for symbolic impact executions that began early, attracted larger audiences, and projected stronger authority. Usk understood this dynamic. He had lived his career inside the administrative systems that now condemned him. The night progressed slowly. No rescue, no reversal, just the steady rhythm of a government preparing an example. By the time the torch in his cell burned low, the scaffold outside was nearly complete. The final hours of Thomas Usk's life passed under the same system that would destroy him, a system he once helped operate. On this morning in 1388, the turnout was exceptionally large. Thomas Usk's sentence, hanging, drawing, and quartering, was the harshest penalty defined under English law. The public understood that such a sentence indicated a political crime, not an ordinary one. Attendance was higher when the condemned person had once been part of government vendors positioned themselves along the edges of the square. Food sellers prepared quickly, bread, ale, and simple hot items. Children sat on their parents' shoulders to see over the adults. The city treated executions as events with predictable patterns, and this predictability assured large attendance. This environment served the state's interest. Executions were not conducted in secret because fear was more effective when witnessed collectively. When the punishment related to treason, visibility became essential. The purpose was to reinforce obedience by demonstrating the consequences of political alignment. Thomas Usk was brought out under guard. He was already weakened from imprisonment and lack of sleep. His face appeared pale, which is consistent with both physical decline and the psychological stress recorded in similar treason cases. Guards supported him physically. Prisoners often struggled to walk steadily at this stage. He was taken to the wooden scaffold, built specifically for the initial phase of the execution. Treason executions followed a structured order. The hanging came first, but unlike standard hangings meant to kill through neck fracture or asphyxiation, a treason hanging was interrupted. Its function was to inflict extreme distress while keeping the prisoner alive for the subsequent stages. Usk was forced up the steps. The noose was placed around his neck in full view of the crowd. Medieval rope hangings were imprecise compared to modern techniques. Death was not instantaneous. The rope restricted airflow and blood supply, creating a prolonged struggle. A bell signaled that the execution would proceed. The hangman pulled the lever. Usk dropped. His body reacted immediately. Involuntary convulsions, leg movements, and hand spasms. These responses were predictable physiological reactions to oxygen deprivation. The rope tightened around his neck, and his vision would have rapidly narrowed as blood flow to the brain decreased. Contemporary descriptions of similar executions emphasize the violent nature of this stage, not because of cinematic drama, but because partial hanging produced irregular and uncontrolled body movements. He was seconds from loss of consciousness. In a standard execution, this point would mark the end. But in a treason case, the objective was not death, but survival long enough to undergo further punishment. The hangman cut the rope. Usk fell onto the wooden platform. Accounts of interrupted hangings describe the aftermath consistently. Intense gasping, choking, and loss of bodily control. The body attempts to compensate for the sudden restoration of airflow. Usk would have been conscious, but barely. The crowd reacted immediately. Public reactions varied, but were documented in multiple treason executions. Shock, excitement, and fear mixed together. Some spectators wanted the full sequence. Others were disturbed by the brutality. The purpose of the public setting was to evoke precisely this combination. A population witnessing extreme state power became more governable. The interruption of the hanging communicated two messages. The condemned was not being killed, he was being prepared. The state held complete control over the prisoner's suffering. This distinction mattered. Executions for ordinary crimes conveyed punishment. Executions for treason conveyed dominance. For Usk, the interrupted hanging was only the first stage. His sentence required that he remain alive for the next phase. Disembowelment and the removal of internal organs while still conscious. The crowd understood what was coming. They had seen or heard descriptions of similar executions. The removal of the prisoner from the hanging was not misunderstood as mercy. It was recognized as escalation. At this point, Usk lay on the scaffold, disoriented, struggling to breathe, and unable to stand without assistance. But the executioners were not concerned with his physical capacity. Medieval treason executions were designed to proceed regardless of the prisoner's condition. Survival was not required for long, only long enough for the next act. The interruption of the hanging marked the transition from a typical execution into the specialized, politically charged punishment reserved for enemies of the state. The final phase of a medieval treason execution required precision. This was not improvised brutality. It followed a defined legal sequence meant to demonstrate state authority. The executioner stepped forward not with urgency, but with procedure. The crowd understood that what came next was the core of the sentence. Thomas Usk was dragged toward the execution block. After the interrupted hanging, his physical capacity was minimal. In historical cases of partial hanging, prisoners often lost motor control, suffered temporary blindness, or experienced severe respiratory distress. Usk showed similar symptoms. His limbs barely responded. He was conscious but not fully aware. The executioner prepared a blade. In treason cases, this stage, the evisceration, was performed publicly and slowly. It served a specific function, to remove from the condemned any remaining dignity and to create a visible symbol of the state's dominance. Execution manuals from the period emphasized that the prisoner must be alive at the moment of incision to satisfy the legal requirement of drawing. The cut was made. This was not quick and not designed for efficiency. The incision was deep enough to open the abdominal cavity. Reactions from medieval crowds were documented in various execution chronicles. Some spectators screamed, some fainted, and others stared in complete silence. Usk's case fits this established pattern. The public was not simply witnessing a death. They were witnessing a state-sanctioned demonstration. The executioner then removed internal organs and held them up. This display was central to the ritual. The act was not symbolic. It was literal proof that the condemned had been unmade. Records indicate that displaying organs to the crowd was intended to reinforce the message that treason led to total physical destruction. The organs were not preserved. Their only purpose was visual impact. But the punishment was not finished. The sentence for treason required dismemberment. The final stage, known as quartering ropes, were tied to Usk's arms and legs. 4 horses were positioned at the edges of the execution ground. Their role was mechanical, to apply force in opposite directions until the body separated. When the signal was given, the horses pulled. Descriptions of quartering from other documented executions indicate that the process was not instantaneous. The body stretched first, joints dislocated, and only with continued force did separation occur. The same physiological sequence would have applied here. Bones cracked under tension, followed by tearing of soft tissue. With a final pull, Usk's body was divided into pieces. His head was severed and raised to the crowd. Decapitation at this stage served 2 functions: identification and closure. A head displayed after quartering acted as the final confirmation of the traitor's defeat. The crowd's reaction varied, but the state's message did not. The limbs, separated and bloodied, were collected. In London, it was standard practice to place the remains of traitors at major gates or bridges. These were high traffic points. Displaying body parts there ensured maximum visibility. Anyone entering or leaving the city would encounter a physical reminder of what treason cost. Usk's remains followed this pattern. His limbs were nailed to structures where they would stay until decay or replacement. The message was unambiguous. Power does not forget, power does not forgive. Power eliminates. Yet the goal of erasing Thomas Usk was only partially achieved. Physically, he was destroyed. Politically, he was silenced. But historically, the attempt to eliminate his memory had the opposite effect. The severity of his punishment preserved his story. His writings survive. Records of his execution survive. And the public spectacle intended to erase him instead made him one of the most documented victims of political justice in 14th century England. They scattered his body to silence his name, but in the end, they only made him unforgettable.